The night Britain held its breath began without warning, like a storm rolling in from nowhere, silent at first but heavy in the air. Rumors had swirled for weeks that King Charles had been unwell, but Buckingham Palace, as always, had downplayed concerns. Royal watchers had noticed his absence from certain public duties, whispers circulated of doctors' visits, and yet the monarchy carried on with its polished front. No one could have prepared for the words that broke through the stillness of the night. "He's no longer with us." For words that would shift the axis of the monarchy forever. In one announcement, history was rewritten, an era was closed, and a new chapter began, faster and with more urgency than anyone could have imagined. It began quietly, almost cruelly so. A small group of royal aides and advisors had been stationed at Clarence House, aware that the king's health had been in steady decline. Some sources claim he had insisted on carrying out his duties until the very end, refusing to relinquish the throne even as his health visibly weakened. He had lived his life waiting to be king, and for only a short time he bore the weight of the crown. For decades, he had stood in the shadow of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Her death had elevated him, finally, into the role he had spent a lifetime preparing for. But his reign, brief and marked with controversy, would not last long enough to leave the lasting legacy he once envisioned. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. By the time news reached the press, Britain was already bracing for what insiders knew as Operation Menai Bridge, the code name for the king's death. Protocols older than most of the palace staff were set in motion, but none of the manuals could prepare the nation emotionally for the moment itself. Streets emptied, as if everyone instinctively knew something monumental had occurred. People clutched their phones, scanning headlines that blurred into disbelief. Some wept openly, recalling a king they barely had the chance to know. Others stood in silence, already questioning what the monarchy's future would look like without him. For those who remembered Elizabeth, Charles's reign had always felt like a bridge between eras, a temporary chapter. Now, the bridge had collapsed, leaving Britain to stare into the unknown. The royal household wasted no time. Behind the blackened drapes of Buckingham Palace, chaos and grief mingled with cold efficiency. Meetings were convened with senior advisors and government officials. Prime ministerial calls were placed, schedules rearranged, orders issued to the armed forces, clergy, and broadcasters. Black ties and mourning suits were readied for public appearances. The machinery of monarchy, ancient, ceremonial, and unyielding, was awakened. And while the world was still absorbing the shock, William and Catherine were being quietly thrust into the roles of king and queen. It was not a matter of choice or delay. The throne does not wait. The instant Charles breathed his last, William became the sovereign. The nation had a new king, and with him, a queen consort who had long been seen as the steady anchor of the family. It is impossible to overstate the magnitude of the moment. For William, the transition was not only a political necessity, but a personal tragedy. He had lost his father. In the span of hours, grief and duty collided, forcing him to compartmentalize emotions in a way no ordinary son ever could. Catherine, too, found herself standing in the middle of history's whirlwind. Once the girl next door, then the Duchess of Cambridge, and later the Princess of Wales, she now carried the title of Queen. That title was not merely symbolic. It carried the weight of expectation, scrutiny, and the eyes of billions across the globe. Together, they represented the monarchy's survival, its attempt to remain relevant in a world increasingly skeptical of its existence. But if the British public was grieving, it was also restless. Questions surfaced almost immediately. Would William take a modern, reformist path, reshaping the monarchy into a leaner, more transparent institution? Or would he cling to the traditions that had bound the crown for centuries? What role would Camilla now play, a widow who had endured decades of criticism and suspicion before finally being accepted by many as queen consort? Would she fade quietly into the background, or would she resist being sidelined? And what of Prince Harry? The estranged son, living thousands of miles away in California, had to reconcile his grief with his fractured ties to the family. For him, the announcement was not just about losing a father. It was about facing a royal world he had left behind, a world that might not welcome him back with open arms, even in tragedy. The death of a monarch is never just a family affair. It is a national and international reckoning. The last time Britain endured such a moment, with Elizabeth II's passing, the world united in mourning for a queen who had become an icon of stability. With Charles, the response was more complicated. His reign was shorter, his controversies fresher in memory, his approval less universal. And yet, the very fact that the crown now passed to William and Catherine meant the monarchy had a chance to reset its course. Some saw it as a tragedy wrapped in opportunity, a painful ending that might save the monarchy from itself. The first hours after the king's death were carefully choreographed, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Advisors debated the timing of public announcements, mindful of the impact on markets, politics, and international relations. Religious leaders prepared statements that would both comfort and remind the public of continuity. The Prime Minister prepared for a televised address that would echo through the annals of history. Every move was scripted, every detail precise, yet behind closed doors emotions ran raw. No palace guard manual could script the tears of a son forced to wear the crown too soon, or the tremor in a widow's voice as she bid farewell to the man she had stood beside through scandal and storm. As dawn broke over London, the weight of the new era became visible. Crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace, placing flowers, kneeling in silence, and waiting for the first glimpse of the new king and queen. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones, broadcasting images of a grieving nation across the globe. Social media pulsed with tributes, criticisms, and speculation. Allies and rivals alike sent messages of condolence. From Washington to Canberra, leaders reminded their people of Britain's historic moment and speculated on what this would mean for their own countries tied to the Commonwealth. The monarchy had not only lost a king, it had been forced into transformation overnight. And here is where the story deepens. Because while the headlines declared Charles gone and William crowned, the truth was not so simple. What lay beneath the surface was a fragile balance of grief, duty, and unresolved fractures within the royal family. Behind every carefully worded press release was a question the monarchy could not yet answer. Would this transition heal the wounds of the past, or would it tear them open further? The image of William and Catherine, poised and graceful, gave the world reassurance. But those who knew history understood that appearances could deceive. A crown passed in haste can carry unseen fractures. A monarchy that looks strongest on the balcony may be weakest in its private chambers. This is not just the story of a king's death. It is the story of a family grappling with duty and loss, of a nation reimagining its future, and of individuals thrust into roles larger than life itself. Over the course of this journey, we will uncover not just the rituals and traditions that guided the overnight transition, but the emotional and political realities that shook the royal family to its core. The grief of Camilla, the burden on William, the quiet strength of Catherine, and the estrangement of Harry. These are not just subplots. They are the human threads that make this moment more than history. They make it a story of heartbreak, transformation, and reckoning. The question now is not whether Britain has a king. It does. The question is whether this monarchy, born out of centuries of tradition and now tested by modern scrutiny, can survive the weight of this transition. Will William and Catherine's reign be the salvation of the crown, or its slow, dignified decline? That is the mystery, the controversy, and the emotional depth this story will take us through. For now, what remains certain is this: he's no longer with us, and nothing will ever be the same again. The first hours after King Charles's passing unfolded like a scene from a silent tragedy, one that those inside Buckingham Palace had rehearsed for decades but dreaded to enact. It was late into the night when the final breath was drawn, and the stillness of Clarence House was broken not by cries, but by hushed voices echoing through hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who had once carried the crown. Doctors confirmed what aides already knew. The king was gone. There was no fanfare, no thunderous announcement, only whispered words that seemed to carry the weight of history. The reign is over. The night of silence had begun, and with it, a new chapter none were ready to face. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was thick with a strange combination of grief and procedure. Staff who had served Charles for decades held back tears as officials moved swiftly to secure the corridors. Every clock seemed to tick louder, every gesture deliberate, as if time itself demanded solemnity. There is a code within the monarchy, a script older than any living memory, that dictates what happens the moment a sovereign dies. It is precise, efficient, and coldly practical. Yet for those who stood closest to the king, it felt almost inhumane. Their loss was personal. The king was not just a monarch. He was a father, a husband, a friend. And yet within minutes of his passing, his name was already being spoken in the past tense. His portrait quietly shifted from sovereign to history. This is the cruel paradox of monarchy. Grief cannot be private, nor can it delay the machinery of state. The death of a king triggers movements as vast as military orders and as intimate as a family gathering. Operation Menai Bridge, the plan long prepared for Charles's death, was put into motion. Phone lines buzzed with encrypted codes, secure communications flashed across government offices, and royal aides moved with military precision. In the stillness of the night, decisions were made that would ripple across the globe by morning. The monarch was dead, and Britain, without hesitation, had a new king. But in those first moments, before the world was told, there was silence. The streets of London remained unaware, the lights of the city twinkling as if nothing had changed. Inside the palace gates, however, reality weighed down like stone. It is said that when a sovereign dies, even the walls of Buckingham Palace seem to absorb the sorrow, and on that night, it felt as though the very air carried mourning. Staff members who had seen Queen Elizabeth's final hours only years earlier now found themselves reliving the trauma with her son. This time, however, the grief was tinged with a sense of unfinished business. Charles had waited a lifetime for the crown, and when he finally wore it, his reign was fleeting. He had barely begun to carve his vision for the monarchy before death struck it from his grasp. In bedrooms across the royal residences, phones began to ring. Senior family members were awakened with the news. William, the heir, received the call that no son is ever truly prepared for. His father was gone, and with that call, his life would never again be his own. He was no longer simply Prince William, the son, the brother, the father of three. He was King William, and his destiny had arrived in the cruelest of ways. Catherine, too, awoke to find herself transformed in an instant. By the time she processed the words, the world had already placed a crown on her head. The couple, who had gone to bed as the Prince and Princess of Wales, rose before dawn as the King and Queen of the United Kingdom. What must that moment have felt like? A mixture of disbelief and dread, the collision of mourning and responsibility. Imagine being told in the same breath that your father is dead and that you must lead an ancient institution into a new era. For William, the weight of duty pressed against the rawness of grief. For Catherine, the reality of queenship loomed larger than ever. Together, they sat in the darkness of that night, knowing that while the world still slept, their lives had been forever rewritten. Meanwhile, Camilla was struck by a grief that could not be contained within ceremony. For years she had walked a difficult path, enduring whispers, criticisms, and comparisons to the late Princess Diana. Her marriage to Charles had been both a love story and a public scandal, a partnership tested by decades of scrutiny. Now she was left alone, stripped overnight of the title queen consort that she had only recently secured. History had prepared her for this moment too, but no manual of monarchy could soothe the emptiness of losing the man she had fought the world to stand beside. Those closest to her said she wept quietly, away from the eyes of advisors and staff, as arrangements for her husband's funeral and her own future role were drawn up without her input. By the early hours, the first signals had reached the media. A sudden blackout of scheduled programs on the BBC, a change in tone from anchors, and the discreet donning of black attire all hinted at the inevitable. But the official announcement was held back, timed carefully to ensure that every detail of protocol was observed. The Archbishop of Canterbury was informed, government ministers were notified, and international allies were discreetly alerted before the nation was told. The palace was determined that the message would not leak prematurely, but in the age of social media, silence itself became suspicious. Whispers turned into speculation, and speculation into near certainty. Something monumental had occurred. And still, outside Buckingham Palace, the world slept on, unaware of the enormity of the night. Inside, however, the family gathered. William and Catherine arrived, faces pale, their steps measured. Camilla stood apart, her grief written in the lines of her face. Other senior royals trickled in, each carrying their own memories of Charles, each processing the moment differently. Prince Harry was far away in California, but he too had received the dreaded call. For him, the silence was louder than any church bell, a reminder of his distance not only from the monarchy, but from the family he once belonged to. His father was gone, and yet he was separated by thousands of miles and immeasurable walls of tension. The night of silence was not just about Charles's death. It was about the moments before the world knew. It was the last time the monarchy existed in two states at once. One where Charles was still present, though gone, and another where William was king, though not yet crowned. It was a fragile interlude, where grief and history sat together in the dark, waiting for dawn to reveal the truth. Those who witnessed it spoke of the surreal stillness, the way every word seemed weighted, every gesture final. The king was gone, and in the gap between death and declaration, silence was the only sound Britain knew. As the night stretched on, preparations intensified. Flags were lowered to half-mast under the cover of darkness. The royal standard was prepared to be raised anew by dawn. Military leaders were summoned for ceremonial coordination, and Parliament was quietly notified of its role in the coming transition. In churches across the country, vicars were alerted to prepare special services of mourning, though congregations would not know why until morning bells tolled. Every detail mattered, every tradition carried weight, and yet for those closest to the king, the formality of it all only deepened their sorrow. The man they knew was gone, reduced to schedules, protocols, and public statements. The night ended not with resolution, but with anticipation. By morning, the world would awaken to the news. Headlines would blaze across screens, crowds would flood to the palace gates, and history would record the date as the day Britain changed forever. But in those hours of darkness, it was still a private grief, a silence shared by only a few. A silence that held the last echoes of Charles's reign, brief though it was. A silence that marked the first breaths of William's. The night of silence was more than the passing of a king. It was the fragile moment between endings and beginnings, between loss and legacy. The first light of dawn carried with it a heavy truth that Britain had not yet been told. On the streets of London, life began as it always did. Commuters boarded buses, shopkeepers raised their shutters, joggers cut through the crisp air. But within hours, the world would shift. The carefully guarded silence of the palace was about to give way to an announcement that would echo through the nation and beyond. The king was dead. As the nation held its breath, the weight of centuries pressed down on everyone who understood what was about to unfold. The announcement was timed with precision. The palace had delayed it through the night, ensuring that governments and institutions across the globe were informed before the public. Even so, word had begun to spread. Broadcasters adjusted their schedules, preparing somber music and black-clad presenters. The BBC, bound by royal protocol, had cleared its programming, its anchors appearing in dark suits with voices hushed, waiting for the official confirmation. And when the words finally came, they carried a chilling finality. His Majesty King Charles III has passed away. In living rooms, in cafes, on buses and trains, people froze. The country stood still. The whispers of speculation were silenced by the bluntness of reality. Crowds gathered almost immediately outside Buckingham Palace. Some came with flowers, some with candles, others with nothing but shock in their faces. There was no script for how to process the loss of a king who had ruled for only a short span. For older generations, it was the reminder that another monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, had only recently left them. For younger ones, Charles had barely been a presence at all. Yet the enormity of the monarchy meant that even those ambivalent about his reign felt the tremor of history in their bones. This was not just about Charles. It was about continuity, about the living thread that bound the nation to its monarchy. And as the cameras rolled, capturing the stunned silence of the crowd, the world joined Britain in mourning. But mourning was not simple. The king's passing had left the nation in a conflicted state. Some remembered Charles as a man who had endured public scandal and ridicule for decades before finally ascending the throne. His time as monarch had been too brief to redefine the institution, too short to escape the shadows of his mother and the controversies of his past. To others, he was a symbol of duty, a man who carried the burden of expectation for over 70 years and bore the crown with quiet determination once it was finally his. The public's grief was as layered as the man himself. Respect mingled with criticism, sympathy intertwined with unease. The media became the voice of the nation's emotions. Radio stations played solemn music, interrupting only to share tributes. Television networks cut between footage of the grieving crowds, commentary from historians, and archival clips of Charles's life. Newspapers rushed special editions into print. "Farewell to the king," some headlines declared. Others chose more somber tones. "An era ends too soon." Yet amid the reflections, one theme emerged. The monarchy had entered another turning point, and the world was watching to see how it would survive. In Parliament, politicians gathered in black attire, paying tribute to the sovereign while speaking of stability and unity. The Prime Minister, in a nationally televised address, spoke of the king's service and sacrifice, framing his reign as a bridge between the steadfastness of Elizabeth and the new future embodied by William. It was a calculated message, designed not only to honor Charles, but to reassure a public that their nation remained steady. In moments like these, the monarchy was not just ceremonial, it was the anchor of the state. And yet, beneath the polished speeches, questions simmered. Could William truly embody the same sense of permanence that his grandmother had? Could Catherine step into the role of queen without faltering under the glare of history? The emotional pulse of the country could be seen not only in the capital, but across its regions. In Scotland, where Charles had spent much of his final days, church bells tolled and mourners lined the streets of Edinburgh. Wales held vigils in Cardiff, where many saw Charles as a complicated figure, loved by some but distant to others. In Northern Ireland, where the monarchy's presence had always been fraught with political tension, tributes were mixed with reminders of unresolved divisions. Each corner of the United Kingdom processed the loss differently, but all felt the magnitude of the moment. Internationally, reactions poured in. From Washington, the American president issued condolences, calling Charles a monarch of dedication, though brief in reign, and a father who bore the weight of his crown with humility. In the Commonwealth realms, the news stirred deeper questions. Canada and Australia, already embroiled in debates over their ties to the monarchy, now faced louder calls for independence. Leaders expressed condolences while their citizens quietly asked, "Should we continue under a monarchy that feels more distant with each passing year?" The king's death was not just a national crisis, it was a global reckoning. For the British people, the immediate instinct was to gather, to stand shoulder to shoulder outside palaces, cathedrals, and town halls. Candles flickered in the evening air. The sound of hymns rose from spontaneous crowds. Strangers embraced in the streets, united by grief even if divided by opinion. And yet there was also unease. Many wondered what came next. Would William and Catherine be crowned swiftly to reassure the world? Would there be a period of reflection, or would the monarchy press forward with tradition? The tension between continuity and change filled every conversation, every broadcast, every headline. Britain was mourning, but it was also waiting to see what future the new king would bring. Among the crowds, the generational divide was stark. Older Britons remembered Charles as the awkward, sensitive Prince of Wales, caught between tradition and his own personal desires. They recalled the turbulent marriage to Diana, the scandals that nearly shattered the monarchy, and the long road to acceptance of Camilla. Younger generations, by contrast, saw him less as a figure of fascination and more as a distant presence. For them, the true symbols of the monarchy had long been William and Catherine, the young family seen as modern and relatable. The king's death was, for them, not only an ending but also the opening of a chapter they had been anticipating, the reign of William and Catherine. The grief for Charles was real, but so too was the cautious hope for the monarchy's future. Through it all, the palace maintained its careful choreography. Statements were issued, tributes shared, but always with an eye toward the next step. For the monarchy, Mourning was inseparable from transition. The throne does not remain empty. The crown does not pause. Even as Britain grieved, the world was being reminded of continuity. The king is dead. Long live the king. The phrase, repeated across networks and newspapers, carried a paradoxical comfort. It acknowledged the loss while affirming stability. Yet to many, it felt jarring. How could one mourn properly when the focus had already shifted to the next monarch? How could grief and coronation exist in the same breath? The nation held its breath not only out of sorrow but also out of anticipation. Britain had lost its king, but it had gained another overnight. What kind of king would William be? What kind of queen would Catherine become? Could they heal the wounds of the family, repair relations with Harry, and restore the monarchy's fractured image? The silence of mourning was heavy, but beneath it pulsed a restless curiosity. Britain was not just grieving, it was bracing for the future. The day closed with a haunting image. Thousands gathered outside Buckingham Palace, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their voices raised in hymns of mourning. The palace balcony remained empty, the black drapes drawn. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the new king and queen would step forward, their faces carrying the weight of both grief and responsibility. Until then, the nation remained suspended, holding its collective breath, caught between the memory of the king it had lost and the hope, or fear, of the monarch it had just gained. Camilla sat in the quiet of Clarence's house, a silence unlike any she had known before. It was not the hush of protocol or the stillness of ceremony, but a silence carved by grief. She had lived her adult life with Charles, in love, in scandal, in the long shadow of Diana, and finally at his side as queen consort. Now, suddenly, that chapter was over. She was a widow, and her place in history had shifted in an instant. For the first time since the world had begun to accept her in the role she had fought decades to reach, she was being pushed to the edges of the stage. Her heartbreak was personal, but her isolation was political. The monarchy had no room for hesitation. The crown had already moved on. For Camilla, the night had unfolded like a cruel replay of her own life story. She had fought for years to be seen not as the interloper, not as the woman in the background, but as Charles's partner, his confidant, his chosen companion. Against all odds, she had ascended to the role of queen consort, her image softened over the years by duty and quiet resilience. And yet, the crown was not hers to hold. With Charles's death, her status was relegated to that of Queen Dowager, a title dignified on paper but diminishing in reality. The woman who had walked behind him at coronations, state visits, and ceremonies now found herself walking alone, unsure where she belonged in the family she had helped to stabilize. Her grief was raw, but it was also complicated. She had loved Charles long before the world had accepted their union. Through the years of Diana's fame and tragedy, Camilla had been vilified, painted as the other woman, the cause of heartbreak that fractured the monarchy. She had endured relentless criticism, survived the ridicule of the press, and faced the icy disdain of a public unwilling to forgive. Time had softened the edges, allowing her to slowly step into the role of wife, then duchess, and finally queen. Yet all of it seemed to crumble in the space of one announcement. Charles was gone, and with him, the fragile acceptance she had earned seemed to evaporate. The headlines already shifted focus from her grief to William and Catherine's ascension. Her heartbreak was overshadowed by the glow of a younger, more popular monarchy. In the early hours after the king's death, age tried to shield her from the onslaught of duties and press inquiries. But the reality was unavoidable. Within the palace corridors, conversations were already turning to the future. What William's reign would look like, how Catherine would step into queenship, how the monarchy would present itself to the world. Camilla's role was discussed in softer tones, like an afterthought. She was the widow, yes, but she was not the future. The cameras would soon turn away from her. The public's sympathy might be momentary, but it would not linger. For a woman who had endured so much to finally reach the throne, the suddenness of her descent into history's margins was a cruel twist of fate. Behind closed doors, her grief was unvarnished. Those who knew her well said she was inconsolable, clutching personal mementos of Charles, rereading notes and letters he had written to her during the years when their love was confined to secrecy. She thought of the decades they had spent carving a path back to one another, of the late nights when Charles leaned on her through political storms, of the small moments of tenderness hidden away from the public eye. To lose him now, at the very moment the world had begun to embrace them together, was a wound too deep for words. And yet, she had no choice but to compose herself, for even in widowhood, appearances mattered. The public response to her grief was mixed. Crowds outside the palace laid flowers not only for Charles, but also in acknowledgement of her loss. Some carried signs of sympathy for the queen consort turned queen dowager. Others, however, could not help but revisit the ghosts of the past, invoking Diana's memory and questioning whether Camilla should ever have been queen at all. Social media was flooded with tributes to Charles, but also with a resurgence of old controversies. For Camilla, this duality was nothing new. She had spent her life caught between vilification and quiet admiration. But in the days following Charles's death, the sharpness of that divide cut deeper than ever. Isolation was not only external but internal. Within the royal family, her place was ambiguous. William had long kept a polite but measured relationship with her, respectful but not close. Catherine, too, had maintained cordiality without intimacy. Now, with the crown upon their heads, William and Catherine were the unquestioned leaders of the monarchy, and Camilla's influence dwindled overnight. She was not part of their vision for the future, nor was she likely to feature prominently in the ceremonial narrative that would unfold. Her isolation was underscored by the contrast between the crowds cheering William and Catherine and the muted recognition of her loss. And yet, despite the loneliness of her grief, Camilla carried herself with the same quiet resilience that had seen her through decades of public judgment. She made appearances, dressed in mourning black, her composure intact even as her eyes betrayed her sorrow. In the halls of Westminster Abbey, she walked alone behind Charles's coffin, her every step a reminder of her shifting role. Commentators spoke of her dignity, her strength, her ability to endure, but few spoke of her pain. It was as though the monarchy itself demanded her silence, a silence that mirrored the private loneliness she had known since the earliest days of her relationship with Charles. The queen consort's isolation highlighted the cruel reality of monarchy's hierarchy. In the end, it is not love or loyalty that defines one's place, it is bloodline. William and Catherine were the future, Harry remained the exiled son, and Camilla was left as the widow. Her love story with Charles, once the subject of endless fascination and controversy, now seemed destined to be written as a footnote in the history of William's ascension. The woman who had fought for decades to be recognized as Charles's equal was now relegated to the margins of a story dominated by others. But to dismiss her as irrelevant would be to underestimate her. Those who knew Camilla best understood that her heartbreak, though quiet, was profound, and her resilience was forged in fire. She had survived the world's scorn, and she would survive this too. Yet there was no denying that her life would never again carry the weight it once had. The throne had moved on, the monarchy had shifted its gaze, and she was left to mourn alone. For the nation, her grief was an afterthought. For her, it was everything. And as the days of mourning unfolded, it became clear that Camilla's role in the monarchy's future would be one of silence, dignity, and distance. The isolation she felt was not merely the solitude of a widow, but the inevitable exile of a woman whose relevance had passed with the man she loved. William had always known the day would come, but never like this. All his life, the word destiny had hovered over him like a shadow he could not escape. From the moment he was old enough to walk beside his mother in public, from the first time photographers called his name, he was marked as the future king. And yet, nothing could have prepared him for the moment when grief and duty collided so violently. In the hours after his father's passing, as the machinery of monarchy surged into action, William found himself standing at the center of history, carrying a burden he had not chosen yet could not refuse. It was no longer a matter of waiting. The crown was his, and with it came an entire nation's expectation. The transition from son to sovereign happened with a swiftness that left little time for mourning. He had barely hung up the phone delivering the dreadful news when aides began arriving at Kensington Palace with documents, briefings, and ceremonial instructions. In the eyes of the world, he was already King William. The weight of the crown pressed down before it even touched his head. Catherine sat beside him in those first hours, her hand clasped over his, grounding him in the storm. Together they listened as advisors outlined the schedule for public appearances, the statements that must be made, the roles they must now embody. The personal loss of a father was subsumed by the public necessity of monarchy. For William, the moment carried a painful symmetry. He remembered vividly the day his mother died, when the world expected him to walk behind her coffin, to bear his grief in public at just 15 years old. Then, as now, his personal pain had been overtaken by duty. But this time the scale was even greater. The monarchy itself rested on his shoulders. His grandmother had ruled for 70 years, embodying stability. His father, though he had waited a lifetime, reigned for only a brief span, leaving behind unfinished work. Now the task of survival fell to William. The continuity of the crown demanded his immediate strength. Catherine's transformation was equally sudden, though she bore it with the quiet poise that had defined her public life. One evening she had been the Princess of Wales, admired for her grace and relatability. By morning, she was Queen Catherine, the face of a new monarchy. Unlike William, she had not been born into this destiny, but she had been preparing for it all the same. Years of public appearances, carefully balanced statements, and quiet acts of service had shaped her into the figure the nation trusted. Now, she would be tested in ways that no consort since Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had endured. Her every gesture would be interpreted, her every word scrutinized. She was no longer simply the supportive wife, she was the queen, and with that title came the responsibility of helping to define an era. The public reaction to their ascension was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds outside the palace gates, still clutching flowers for Charles, began to chant William's name. Many spoke of him as the king the nation had long awaited, the monarch who could finally modernize the institution and bring it closer to the people. His youth compared to Charles, his reputation as a family man, and Catherine's popularity combined to paint a picture of renewal. The world had little time to dwell on Charles's death before attention shifted to the couple who now symbolized the monarchy's future. For William, the pressure was immense. The nation did not see a grieving son. They saw a king expected to steady the ship in turbulent waters. Behind the palace walls, William wrestled with emotions that few could fathom. He mourned his father, but he also felt the lingering complexities of their relationship. Charles had been a man torn between duty and desire, tradition and modernity. Their bond had often been strained, shadowed by the memory of Diana and the controversies that had defined the family's public life. William loved his father, but he also carried scars from the years when the monarchy itself seemed fractured beyond repair. Now, he was tasked with healing those wounds while carrying the crown his father had worn for such a brief time. The challenge was not only to lead, it was to restore trust in an institution increasingly questioned by its own people. Catherine's burden was different, but no less heavy. She was stepping into a role that would define her for the rest of her life. Her every choice, from her wardrobe to her words, would be dissected as symbolic of the monarchy's direction. Already, commentators spoke of her as the monarchy's greatest asset, the woman who could secure its survival. She represented a modern ideal, educated, relatable, and yet dignified enough to embody the crown's mystique. But the crown is no ornament. It is a relentless weight, demanding sacrifice, scrutiny, and the loss of privacy. Catherine understood that the freedom she had enjoyed, limited as it already was, had now vanished completely. Every moment forward would belong not just to her family, but to the nation. The couple's first joint appearance as king and queen carried an almost surreal atmosphere. Dressed in mourning black, they stepped out to greet the crowds outside Buckingham Palace. The silence of thousands broke into a chorus of cheers and sobs. Some reached out to touch William's hand. Others pressed bouquets into Catherine's arms. The faces of the people reflected the dual emotions of grief and hope. William spoke briefly, his voice steady despite the weight of his words, assuring the nation that he and Catherine would serve with dedication. It was the first glimpse of a reign that had been thrust upon them overnight, and though brief, it left an impression. Cameras flashed, commentators dissected, and the world watched as a son transformed into a sovereign and a wife into a queen. But the burden did not ease once the crowds dispersed. Within hours, William was meeting with the Prime Minister, discussing matters of state that could not be postponed. Constitutional obligations allowed no pause for mourning. Catherine, meanwhile, met with senior palace staff, beginning the work of reorganizing her household into one befitting a queen. The machinery of monarchy moved relentlessly forward, even as the couple barely had time to process their loss. In private, William confided to aides that the transition felt surreal, as though he had stepped into a role rehearsed but never fully believed. Yet there was no time to linger in disbelief. The nation needed leadership, and the world needed reassurance. The crown William bore was not only gold and jewels, it was the weight of expectation. He was expected to be both modern and traditional, approachable and dignified, a reformer and a guardian of history. Catherine's crown carried similar contradictions. She had to embody both elegance and relatability, to bridge the gap between monarchy and public in ways no queen before her had attempted. Together, they were not merely rulers. They were symbols, expected to reassure a world uncertain of monarchy's place in the 21st century. For William, the burden was compounded by the unresolved fractures within his family. His estranged brother, Harry, loomed over the moment like a ghost. The world wanted to know whether Harry would return for the funeral, whether the brothers would reconcile, whether the monarchy could present a united front. William knew the questions would not go away, and Catherine knew her role in supporting him would only grow more vital. Their private struggles, grief, exhaustion, tension, could not be shown. The monarchy's survival depended on their composure. That first night, after the crowds had gone and the cameras dimmed, William and Catherine sat together in their residence, the silence heavier than words. Their children, too young to fully understand, asked questions that pierced the armor of protocol. Where's Grandpa now? Why is everyone crying? Why do people call you king? William answered as best he could, his voice steady even as his heart faltered. Catherine comforted the children, her own strength drawn from the knowledge that their family was not just their own, it was Britain's. The burden was immense, but it was theirs to carry. This was the moment William and Catherine had been propelled toward all their lives, though neither had expected it so soon. The King and Queen of Britain had been crowned not by ceremony, but by circumstance, their reign beginning in the shadow of grief. The burden was great, the crown heavy, and the path uncertain. Yet as the world looked on, the couple stood together, embodying the fragile hope of a monarchy at a crossroads. William's burden was now the nation's, and Catherine's crown was not just a symbol but a promise that they would carry the institution forward, no matter the cost. The news reached Harry in California as the night sky gave way to dawn. A call, abrupt and heavy, carried across the ocean. His father was gone. In that moment, the fragile walls he had built around himself trembled. For years, Harry had lived as both prince and outcast, tethered to the monarchy by blood but estranged from it by choice and circumstance. Now, with Charles's death, he was caught between two identities, grieving son and distant exile. His heart ached with the loss, but his mind braced for the inevitable storm. The world would demand to see him beside his family, even as he questioned whether there was still a place for him at their side. The brothers' divide had long been a wound hidden in plain sight. Once inseparable, William and Harry had walked through life as comrades, bonded by the trauma of their mother's death and the weight of royal expectation. They had been the young faces of the monarchy, the hope of a new generation. But over time, the bond had frayed into something colder, harder. Differences in duty, outlook, and personal choices widened the gap until it seemed unbridgeable. William remained the heir, bound to tradition, steady and reserved. Harry chose independence, carving a life outside the monarchy with Meghan by his side. The fracture became public, and the world watched as the once united brothers drifted into silence. Now, fate demanded that they stand together again. For William, the prospect of Harry's return stirred conflicting emotions. On one hand, he longed for his brother, the companion of his youth, the boy who had walked beside him behind Diana's coffin. On the other, he carried resentment for the interviews, the books, the accusations that had painted the family in scandalous light. William had stepped into the role of monarch, burdened with expectation, while Harry had seemed to reject the very institution that defined their lives. In this moment of grief, William needed unity, but he feared confrontation. The nation would be watching not only how he bore the crown, but also how he handled his brother. Harry faced his own torment. Flying back to Britain would mean stepping into a firestorm. Every movement, every glance, would be dissected. Would he stand close to William, or apart? Would Meghan accompany him, or would she remain in America, wary of the vitriol that often greeted her on British soil? Already, the press speculated endlessly. Would the funeral of the king force reconciliation or deepen the rift? Harry knew that his father's death was not just a family matter. It was political, symbolic, and public. His grief could not be private. It would be judged, weighed, and inevitably criticized. The divide between the brothers was not only personal, it was philosophical. William believed in the crown as a sacred duty, something to be preserved at all costs. Harry saw it as a gilded cage, suffocating and destructive. Their lives had diverged, and with them their loyalties. Yet, in their father's death, they were once again bound together by blood and memory. Charles had always hoped for reconciliation, though he rarely pressed it openly. He had worried aloud to friends that his sons might never heal their relationship, that the monarchy itself was fractured by their discord. Now, with him gone, the question loomed larger than ever. Would grief unite them, or would it seal the divide? Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, aides prepared for Harry's arrival. Discussions turned tense. Should he be given prominence in ceremonies? Would Meghan be welcomed or sidelined? Could the family risk another public spectacle? Advisors urged William to extend an olive branch, at least for appearances, but he remained cautious. Trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Catherine, ever the diplomat, urged restraint and composure. She knew the monarchy could not afford to appear divided at such a crucial moment. But she also understood William's pain. To stand beside Harry again meant reopening old wounds. The public, too, waited anxiously. For many, the image of William and Harry together was as symbolic as the crown itself. They remembered the sight of two boys walking behind their mother's coffin, an image that had defined their generation. Could the death of their father produce a moment of similar unity? Or would the bitterness of recent years overshadow even the solemnity of mourning? Social media lit up with speculation, some calling for reconciliation, others fanning the flames of division. The monarchy's survival, some argued, depended not only on William and Catherine, but also on whether the brothers could stand side by side without hostility. When Harry finally boarded a plane bound for London, the cameras followed every step. His arrival was broadcast across networks, his every expression analyzed. He appeared weary, somber, and distant, a man carrying not only grief but the burden of estrangement. Meghan was absent, her decision to stay behind interpreted in conflicting ways. To some, it was an act of respect, sparing the family further tension. To others, it was proof of the deep rift. Either way, Harry's solitary arrival heightened the drama. The image of the prodigal son returning alone became the focus of countless headlines. Inside the palace, the first encounter between the brothers was brief and formal. A nod, a handshake, perhaps a few quiet words. Details were tightly guarded, but reports suggested no warmth, only necessity. In public, they would stand together for ceremonies, their movements choreographed to prevent misinterpretation. But behind closed doors, the gulf remained. William, bearing the crown, stood taller, composed, every inch the king. Harry, dressed in black but stripped of royal duties, stood apart, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of division. The funeral preparations brought the divide into sharper focus. Decisions had to be made. Where would Harry sit? What role would he play? How much of him would the cameras show? The monarchy's survival depended on unity, yet every gesture carried risk. If Harry was placed too prominently, it might suggest reconciliation that did not exist. If he was sidelined, it could deepen the perception of cruelty and exclusion. For William, the decisions were agonizing. He knew the world would judge him not only as king, but as brother. For Harry, every choice seemed to underline his exile. Each step a reminder that though he was family, he was no longer truly royal. In the days that followed, the brothers' divide became a quiet subplot beneath the grandeur of mourning. Crowds gathered, but their eyes often flicked not only to the coffin draped in the royal standard, but to the distance, or closeness between William and Harry. Commentators spoke of body language, of glances exchanged or avoided, of whether Catherine offered subtle gestures of bridge building. The monarchy's story was not only about the crown. It was about the family at its core, fractured and fragile, carrying the burden of history while failing to heal its own wounds. The brothers divided. This was the story as much as Charles's death, and it was a story with no clear resolution. Would grief bring them closer, as the nation hoped, or would it remind them of the chasm that had grown too wide to cross? As William stepped into kingship and Harry into further exile, the answer remained uncertain. What was certain, however, was this: the monarchy could not escape their divide. It would either survive in spite of it, or be reshaped by it forever. Behind the black iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the world saw solemn faces, drawn curtains, and a sea of flowers piling up at the gates. But inside, beyond the gilded walls and centuries-old paintings, a different reality unfolded, one of urgency, strategy, and controlled chaos. The Palace War Room, as it has long been called by insiders, became the epicenter of the monarchy's survival plan in the hours after King Charles's death. While the nation wept and the world speculated, courtiers, advisors, and senior royals sat around long oak tables under harsh lights, orchestrating every detail of what would happen next. The palace operates with precision, but in those moments, precision carried the weight of necessity. The king was dead, and the monarchy could not falter for even a breath. The nation looked to Buckingham Palace for stability, and it was here, behind closed doors, that the monarchy's machinery roared to life. Every move had to be calculated. The timing of announcements, the placement of royals at ceremonies, the sequence of public appearances, even the choice of words in official statements. The smallest misstep could send shockwaves across a fragile monarchy already scrutinized by a skeptical public. In the war room, the first hours were dominated by Operation Menai Bridge, the meticulously prepared plan for Charles's death. But plans, however polished, always encounter reality. The sheer speed of Charles's decline had caught some advisors off guard, forcing them to improvise around the rigid protocols. Senior courtiers debated whether William should immediately address the nation or wait until after the funeral rites. Others insisted on projecting strength through rapid appearances, reminding the public that the monarchy was unshaken. Some voices cautioned patience, urging sensitivity to grief, while others warned that delay could look like weakness. At the head of these discussions sat William himself, newly crowned in title if not yet in ceremony. Though his heart was heavy, he knew he could not remain silent. The nation demanded to hear from its king, and the world demanded assurance. Catherine sat quietly by his side, listening more than speaking, but her presence alone shifted the tone of the room. Advisors glanced toward her, recognizing the role she would play in shaping public perception. To the courtiers, William was the king, but Catherine was the face of continuity and compassion, a symbol of reassurance in uncertain times. Other royals were present, though their roles varied. Camilla attended briefly, her grief palpable, her voice low, before withdrawing to mourn privately. And, ever pragmatic, pressed for tradition and adherence to the script, while Edward and Sophie offered measured input, reminding the group of public sentiment beyond London. The absence of Harry was notable, his name mentioned only in hushed tones. His estrangement complicated the narrative, and yet the palace could not ignore him entirely. His place in ceremonies had to be decided, his presence factored into the choreography of mourning. Every royal, whether beloved or controversial, was a piece on the board that had to be carefully placed. The room itself bore witness to history. Maps of ceremonial routes were laid out across polished tables, timetables scribbled onto whiteboards, phones ringing incessantly as aides coordinated with government officials and foreign embassies. Aides carried folders stamped with crests, containing drafts of speeches, lists of dignitaries, and seating arrangements for ceremonies. Military liaisons stood by to brief on gun salutes and processions. Clergy consulted on the order of services. Even in grief, the monarchy functioned like a state within a state, its machinery vast and relentless. Amid the formality, there were flashes of humanity. Some aides wept quietly while continuing their work. Others paused, staring into space, the enormity of the moment pressing down. William himself, though steady in public, allowed glimpses of his anguish in private exchanges, his jaw tightening, his voice breaking slightly when speaking of his father. Catherine reached for his hand at one point, a silent reminder that they were not only monarchs, but also children who had lost a parent. The war room also revealed the fractures within the institution. Debates grew heated at times, especially regarding media strategy. Some advisors pushed for transparency, arguing that secrecy would only breed speculation. Others insisted that too much openness would invite scandal and weaken the monarchy's mystique. One particularly tense exchange centered on Harry. Should the palace issue a statement about his return or remain silent? Some argued that ignoring him would appear cruel, while others insisted that his presence should not overshadow the new king. These disagreements underscored a reality long hidden from public view. The monarchy is not a seamless institution, but a family and bureaucracy constantly negotiating its survival. Security, too, dominated discussions. The sudden swell of crowds outside royal residences posed logistical challenges. Police and military coordination was ramped up, with intelligence briefings warning of potential disruptions or protests. In an era of heightened scrutiny, the monarchy could not afford security lapses. The palace war room functioned not only as a command center for ceremony, but also as a hub for protection, ensuring that every royal move was shielded from risk. International pressure added another layer. Messages of condolence from world leaders poured in, each requiring acknowledgement. Commonwealth nations requested clarity on William's position as their head of state, sparking debates about whether to reaffirm ties or remain neutral. Advisors reminded William that his first words as king would be heard not only in Britain but across continents, shaping the monarchy's global image. Every sentence mattered. Every pause carried meaning. Through it all, William's demeanor hardened. In the span of a day, he transformed from heir apparent to sovereign, from grieving son to head of state. Those present remarked on his composure, though behind the mask lay exhaustion and sorrow. Catherine's role became increasingly evident, her calm presence diffusing tensions, her quiet words urging empathy in discussions that leaned toward cold pragmatism. Together, they projected the image of stability the monarchy so desperately needed, even as their private grief remained buried beneath the weight of duty. The palace war room was, in many ways, a paradox. It was both a place of mourning and strategy, of human frailty and institutional calculation. Those within its walls knew they were not simply managing ceremonies. They were preserving the monarchy itself. Every decision they made in those hours would shape the reign of William and Catherine, determine the public's trust, and influence the monarchy's survival. The weight of history pressed upon them, and though the world saw only black suits and bowed heads, behind closed doors, it was a battlefield of words, wills, and strategies. By the time dawn gave way to morning, the war room had mapped out the next several days with near-military precision. Announcements were scheduled, appearances planned, routes charted. The machinery of monarchy was in motion, unstoppable, unyielding. Yet beneath the polished exterior, those who had sat in that room would remember forever the rawness of those hours, the grief of losing a king, the burden of crowning another, and the knowledge that history had turned a page under their watch. The morning after the announcement of King Charles's death, Britain awoke to a stillness that was almost unbearable. It was as though the nation itself had stopped breathing, caught between disbelief and sorrow. Across the country, shopkeepers delayed opening their doors, commuters walked in silence, and church bells tolled mournfully through city streets and countryside villages alike. The weight of loss pressed against every corner of the United Kingdom. Though Charles's reign had been short compared to his mother's, the loss of a monarch, any monarch, was more than personal grief. It was a rupture in continuity, a reminder that even crowns cannot outlive mortality. In London, thousands poured toward Buckingham Palace, some clutching flowers, others carrying handwritten notes or photographs. The air smelled of roses, lilies, and damp paper from hastily scribbled messages. A sea of umbrellas opened under the light drizzle, yet no one moved away. The people stood together, bound not only by respect for the king, but by the pull of history itself. To witness the death of a sovereign was to stand at the edge of eras, and those who gathered wanted to be part of that moment. Children perched on shoulders to glimpse the gates, teenagers snapped photos, elders clasped hands in silent prayer. The monarchy may have been questioned in recent years, but its ability to summon collective mourning remained undeniable. Elsewhere in the nation, mourning took on unique forms. In Scotland, where Charles had spent much of his final days at Balmoral, the grief was personal, almost intimate. Locals who had seen him walk the hills or attend services at Crathy Kirk gathered with candles, singing hymns in Gaelic and English. In Wales, choirs filled Cardiff's streets with song, their voices rising in haunting harmony that echoed centuries of tradition. In Northern Ireland, vigils were held in both Catholic and Protestant communities, an unexpected gesture of unity, however brief. Each region expressed its sorrow differently, but all carried the same undercurrent. The king was gone, and the nation was altered. The churches became sanctuaries of grief. Cathedrals opened their doors at dawn, their interiors lit by flickering candles and filled with the sound of solemn organ music. Priests and vicars, some visibly emotional, welcomed mourners of all faiths. In Westminster Abbey, the same space where Charles had been crowned not long before, prayers were offered for his soul, and the enormity of the monarchy's fragility became palpable. For many, it was a cruel irony. The man who had waited a lifetime for the crown now lay in death only a short while after finally wearing it. Worshippers wept not only for Charles, but also for what his passing symbolized: the fleeting nature of power, the inescapability of time. Public displays of mourning extended beyond the UK. In Canada, Parliament observed a moment of silence, and the Canadian flag was lowered. In Australia, thousands placed flowers outside government buildings, though not without murmurs of debate over whether the monarchy should continue to play a role in their future. Across the Commonwealth, grief intertwined with political reflection. Some mourned genuinely, recalling Charles's visits, his advocacy for environmental issues, and his commitment to service. Others saw his passing as an opportunity to revisit long-simmering questions about independence from the crown. Mourning was not only emotional but also political, and in that duality lay the challenge William would inherit. Back in Britain, the media became the voice of collective sorrow. Newspapers carried black-bordered front pages with Charles's portrait, his eyes staring out in timeless solemnity. Broadcasters aired tribute documentaries, chronicling his life from boyhood to his final months. Radio stations played hushed classical pieces, their presenters speaking with voices thick with emotion. The BBC, the monarchy's unofficial herald, remained in near-constant coverage, capturing scenes of grief from every corner of the country. Yet, even as tributes poured in, subtle undercurrents of criticism remained. Commentators debated his legacy, some praising his environmentalism and charity work, others pointing to controversies that never truly faded. The mourning was national, but it was not unanimous. For ordinary Britons, mourning took on deeply personal forms. Families gathered around dinner tables to discuss memories of Charles's life. Teachers led moments of silence in classrooms, and strangers offered comfort to one another in parks and streets. Stories surfaced of Charles's private acts of kindness. A farmer recalling a handwritten letter of encouragement, a charity worker speaking of his quiet support for disadvantaged youth, a musician recalling his patronage of the arts. These glimpses of humanity softened the public image of a man whose reign had been short, but whose life had been long and complex. For many, the mourning was not just for the king, but for the father, the grandfather, the man who had sought to balance tradition with modernity. Yet, mourning was not without tension. Protests, though small, emerged in certain cities, with voices questioning the cost of monarchy at a time of economic hardship. Placards reading, "Not my king," appeared alongside flowers and candles, a reminder that grief and dissent can coexist. The police, careful not to inflame tensions, managed the demonstrations quietly, understanding that the monarchy's image during this period depended heavily on how it responded to criticism. The sight of grief-stricken crowds interspersed with dissenting voices revealed the complex relationship Britain maintained with its monarchy, reverence woven with skepticism, loyalty tinged with doubt. In schools, children were asked to draw pictures or write letters in memory of the king. Some drew crowns, others hearts, a few wrote simple words, "Thank you." For them, Charles was not a figure of controversy, but simply a grandfatherly presence, someone who had always been there until he was not. Their innocence reflected the purest form of mourning, unburdened by politics or legacy. It was a reminder that at the heart of the monarchy was not only ceremony but humanity, and that grief, no matter how public, remained personal. The monarchy itself participated in the mourning, though every gesture was weighed for symbolism. William and Catherine, now king and queen, appeared before the crowds, their faces etched with grief. They accepted flowers, bowed their heads, and spoke softly to mourners. Their presence brought comfort, yet also underscored the swiftness of transition. The nation was grieving Charles, but it was also acclimating to William and Catherine as their new sovereigns. The balance was delicate, to honor the past while embodying the future, to mourn without lingering so long that continuity appeared stalled. In villages and towns far from London, the grief was quieter but no less heartfelt. Pubgoers raised glasses in Charles's memory, choirs held impromptu vigils, and farmers paused their work to reflect on a man they had long known as prince before he became king. The countryside, where Charles had spent much of his life advocating for sustainable farming and environmental stewardship, mourned him with a particular intimacy. For many rural communities, he had been more than a distant monarch. He had been a supporter, a listener, a presence who cared for their way of life. His loss was felt as personally as it was nationally. A nation in mourning is never a simple portrait. It is a mosaic of grief, memory, criticism, and hope. Britain's mourning for Charles carried all of these elements. The sorrow was real, the rituals timeless, the tributes sincere. Yet beneath it all lay questions of legacy and the future. Could William and Catherine rise to the challenge of embodying both tradition and modernity? Would the monarchy survive the scrutiny of a world less forgiving, less reverent than before? These questions lingered in every vigil, every candle, every bouquet placed at palace gates. As night fell, cities across the United Kingdom glowed with candlelight. From Edinburgh to Cardiff, Belfast to London, the nation mourned together, even in its divisions. Streets were quiet, pubs played subdued music, and even the bustling underground felt hushed. The loss of a king had turned Britain inward, forcing it to reflect not only on a man but on itself. This was the essence of mourning in monarchy. It was never just about death, but about the living, about how a nation chose to carry forward. And as Britain mourned, it knew one truth above all: the past was gone, the present uncertain, and the future lay in the hands of a new king and queen.